Thanks to all the speakers. These were fascinating talks, and in their own way, I think each is getting at a concept that I think Kathy mentioned very briefly, or perhaps it was Hill who mentioned it, how to live a certain kind of life. But my question is for Steve, and as you were talking a great deal about habits and hexis and nudging and influence and so on, I couldn't help thinking of the vast body of discourse which is emerging in ethical philosophy now on virtue talk. You mentioned the word virtue a couple of times. And so you got me thinking about what's the difference between talking about a habit and a virtue, or for that matter, a disposition. I guess my question is how comfortable you would be with virtue talk. I guess just as a lead-in to that question, it seems to be to engage a lot in virtue talk rather than habit talk would be, first of all, to link up with that, again, vastly emergent body of ethical thought, which is championing virtue theory as opposed to utilitarianism, another word you used briefly, and deontological ethics. But it also seems to me that you can't go very far in describing a virtue without naming it. You know, the virtue of prudence, the virtue of compassion, and so on, where it seems to me habits you can avoid naming them, and you can be kind of operational in describing. The habit of, you know, checking in and eating healthy foods and so on is not the same as the virtue of, you know, however you might name that. So I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about how you see the relationship of your project to the vocabulary of virtue talk.
So the quick answer is what John, right? What John just laid out is basically kind of more like Aristotelian virtue ethics, that kind of stuff. What I'm trying to do is stretch that more into an ontological dimension. So I'm going to use the H word, Heidegger. Sorry, I know he's been more of a contentious figure these days, but the way I'm trying to like less stay within a rigid kind of Aristotelian framework, and I'm trying to push on more towards what if habit becomes more of a full-blown kind of ontological dimension. So these are things that like Rivasone, Merleau-Ponty, Bergson, on up in the present, people start engaging with Hexy specifically, Aristotle, and they'll try to push him in more like habit is kind of like an ecological, organismic mode of being. So the reason I mentioned the H word Heidegger is because there, when you move to ontology, then questions shift more from naming the specific habits to kind of keeping the question open, so to speak, to make room for a diversity of habits that people might want to populate and use within persuasive technologies, virtual reality, these kinds of things, rather than just getting kind of circumscribed by the kind of narrow neoliberal aims of some kind of current designers or government control tactics, things along those lines. So thank you for fleshing out the first part of Aristotelian virtue ethics that I didn't have time to get into. But that's my short answer, is that I'm trying to push it more towards, so I guess my ethics would be more in relationship to an ontology of habit that subsequent commentators will develop out.
So this question is for Caddie. So we've seen hashtags get hijacked. You know, McD stories, Susan album party, wanted to parse that one right. So does the hashtag actually offer a way to overcome social media echo chambers, or does it wind up reinforcing certain norms and mores of its own? Classic example I can think of is Justine Sacco, PR flack, about a year ago, tweeted a kind of offensive tweet, and rightfully so, was a pariah for it, in my own personal opinion. But it wound up kind of taking a life of its own, one I don't think she ever intended, and I think a lot of people never intended. That's all I got.
Merely in an echo chamber. I guess I don't understand the question. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit?
Sure, sorry.
So I understand Justine Sacco, and I understand the complexities of that, but what do you mean by echo chamber exactly?
Okay, sorry, I'll elaborate. So certain social media outlets are self-selecting. So Facebook, you have your own Facebook friends. I don't know, Tumblr, you have followers, and certainly there's an element of going out and searching for people whom you've never met before, have no connection with, and you can kind of get outside opinions. Another one, Reddit, is famous for this. So there's a certain self-selection, and so when people are, it reinforces certain expectations for rhetoric, personal behavior, stuff like that. I mean, my friends might be very progressive, and so maybe I friend a coworker on Facebook. Now all of a sudden they are posting like conservative stuff, let's say. Those people tend to get pushed out, and vice versa. You're somebody who's very progressive, all of your friends are conservative, all of a sudden you can't figure out why nobody's on your friends list anymore, that kind of thing. Do you see hashtags, because Twitter is truly global, there's no real self-selection there, do you see that as an effective means of overcoming those kind of little insular bubbles?
Yeah, I mean, I do. It kind of speaks to Burke's identification quandary, right? Everyone who wants to enter into the conversation has to use the same hashtag, no matter what they're doing with the hashtag. So I guess I do, yeah.
This question's for Kathy. It might be a silly one, but I was thinking of Hill and the elocution movement, and I have a couple of students now that are interested in using the arguments about elocution from the 19th century to talk about emojis as a kind of, they're looking at, Gilbert Austin has the charts about the hands and sort of using those. But I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about sort of what Hill might think about the use of emojis, or how that kind of factors into a kind of, connecting those older forms of delivery with newer ones.
Actually, I think it makes perfect sense. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I think it makes perfect sense, actually. And I actually had some Gilbert in the slideshow, and I took it out because I thought I was going too far afield. The interesting part here is that Hill's, or one interesting part, is that Hill's really was very oriented to helping people, climb a social ladder. It strikes me that a lot of what he's recommending and what your students are attracted to is going to be used for very different kinds of purposes. So that the class issue has in some ways been inverted, and also it's not so vertical anymore, it's much more horizontal or flat, I would say. And so in that sense, I mean, absolutely. It is pretty funny. I mean, when you look at the dandy and the confident man, for example, there is something to be said for someone having some confidence, and that actually does make a difference. And the figures that he points to, and this is the element of the visual as well, really do tell that kind of story. That delivery is about some kind of energy and some kind of force, which I thought was sort of interesting in relation to some of the conversation we had yesterday about delivery and force. So I think there are actually lots of connections here, and would be happy to tease them out. So thanks for the question.
Not so much a question, but the dandy, I just like to replace that with hipster.
One should not do this. When I bought this book, it's the only time I've ever bought anything on eBay, and so I found it and I thought, I want this, and they were offering over $75, and I thought, I don't want it that much, and I thought, I'm going to put in for 50, and I, of course, immediately got it. Now I really understand how eBay works. But the other thing that was interesting is I was sitting about this morning, listening to talk about multimodal composing and how a lot of this work changes that game. I had this impulse, which I'm fairly certain, given as frugal as I am, that I will not enact. But there's something here about what you could do with this as a material remix text, and that might be one place to start.
And thank you all for coming.